It's an iconic work. It's an image which everyone knows.
It's one of the most well-known images in art history, second only to the Mona Lisa.
Over a century has passed since Edvard Munch painted The Scream.
Whether you're holding it in your hands or you're looking at it on the wall of a museum, it will tell you straight away it's a masterpiece.
But who was this troubled artist, and how did this image come to represent a lifetime's work?
It was a fantastically important picture to Munch. It's a kind of central figure in his painting at that time.
It's something that has crossed continents, cultures, everyone knows it.
So why in recent years has it become such an object of desire for enthusiasts and thieves alike?
For as long as I can remember, I have suffered from a deep feeling of anxiety which I have tried to express in my art.
Edvard Munch was a troubled soul, as can clearly be seen in his paintings. He lived for many years in poverty, and his unusual and often frightening style took a long time to be fully embraced by the artistic community.
We now know Edvard Munch as the creator of some of the most, say, arresting, haunting, expressionistic images of the 20th century.
Probably the only well-known Norwegian artist of the late 19th and 20th century.
He was an emotional artist, and he worked when the inspiration came.
Enormously influential on German Expressionism.
Today, The Scream is the most famous painting, but for him, in his time when he produced it, it was just one painting. He didn't thought, okay, now I'm painting my most important work.
Munch created his most iconic work, The Scream, early in his career. Little did he know that it would come to define his legacy and that it would be the target of so very many thieves, and just how hard it would be to recover. Edvard Munch was born on the 12th of December 1863 in the small village of Adelsbrück. His family moved to Oslo, then known as Christiania, when he was only 2. Munch had been born into a Norwegian art scene that had blossomed in recent decades, especially with the paintings of Norway's landscape by the celebrated Johan Christian Dahl. Just like Munch, Dahl had come from a very modest Norwegian background. However, Munch's chances of following in Dahl's footsteps and traveling the world seemed very slim from the outset.
I think his childhood was horrible. His mum died when he was 4 of TB, so presumably had spent the first 4 years of his life listening to her cough, which can't have been nice.
Edvard did have a difficult childhood. There were a number of family tragedies and 2 deaths.
There were quite a lot of diseases in the family, caused by the climate, by the bad house.
His father brought the children up on a mixture of Hellfire, Damnation and Edgar Allan Poe, so I think that explains a lot about Munch's later life, really.
Although he displayed early talent, Munch would only find his artistic calling in his late teenage years.
His most influential teacher was Christian Krog, one of the great realistic and social critic artists in Norway. Munch really got his radical breakthrough in the middle of the 1880s with the painting The Sick Child. How he painted this was totally uncommon. He was like scrapping the color with knives, and there are really a lot of layers in this painting. It really divided the public opinion.
There is undoubtedly an edge of darkness from his work from the very beginning. It's there all along. He was someone who was living on the borderlines of sanity and insanity.
Many of Munch's paintings from this era in his career are missing. It's possible that they may have been confiscated by his overtly pious father, who was covering his son's expenses, yet disapproved of his new direction. But Edvard had a chance to break out on his own.
Munch was actually born into a family where they had several quite well-known artists. One of them was an artist called Fritz Taulo, and he had close links to Paris, was quite well known in Paris, and he sponsored Munch to go for the first time. And he went into the studio of Léon Bonnat, who was a pretty traditional painter, and they quite quickly came to blows. I think he immediately knew that he found it stifling, he found it dull.
Léon Bonnat's style of painting may not have been to Munch's taste, but he did appreciate his tours of the Parisian galleries. Paris was right in the middle of the Belle Époque, and the work of many of the greatest artists of the era was on show. One of them, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, had also been a student of Léon Bonnat. Edvard Munch was stunned by what he saw.
Paris, of course, was in this time the mecca, the magnet for all artists. They had to go there, they had to see what is happening here.
He made 2 big trips to Paris. The first time he came back, having seen Impressionism, he'd seen Monet and Manet. But it's really the second trip when he finds Gauguin and Van Gogh, pre-expressionist, if you like.
Following the death of Van Gogh in 1890, there was the big retrospective in 1891, which undoubtedly he related to as an artist who was projecting emotion through colour, through line, through expression in art.
Paris at the time was sort of a marketplace of various painterly styles after Impressionism. And I think, although he experiments with a lot of things from Paris and is indeed keen to show his knowledge of Impressionist painting, for instance, we don't see him really catching on to one truly Parisian way of painting.
Munch always wanted to be a kind of Parisian artist because this was the center, but he got a lot of friends and supporters in Berlin and in other German cities like Hamburg, Lübeck, Dresden, and so on. So he was more or less 20 years in Germany.
Munch would have his greatest breakthrough in Berlin. He tried to model his works on what he'd seen in Paris, trying out the Impressionist style, the Realist style, even painting in the Pointillist style of Georges Seurat. But Berlin was where he found his true voice.
Painting picture by picture, I followed the impressions my eye took in at heightened moments. I painted only memories, adding nothing, no details that I did not see. Hence the simplicity of the paintings, their emptiness.
Munch loved Berlin. I think he really found his place there. He found people who were willing to listen to him, who saw him as a proponent of new ideas. And in 1892, he had been asked to come over with 35 works and do an exhibition for the Association of Berlin Artists.
The Berlin Art Association at that time was a very conservative circle of artists, and I don't think anyone expected what Munch brought to the show. So within a week, the show was closed down.
They thought he was an anarchist, I think. So the Verein themselves, the club, just thought he was nuts. Critics went wild, and of course he loved it. He thought it was fantastic. He said, "I've never had so much fun," or words to that effect.
This made him a real hero for the younger generation, someone to look up to and someone who was breaking the norm and paving the way for them.
Immediately, a lot of invitations from other cities in Germany for exhibitions, and Munch hired an own room only some months later in Berlin to make his private exhibition there. So in 1893, the Scream was exhibited the first time in Berlin.
One evening, I was walking along a path. The city was on one side and the fjord below. I felt tired and ill. I stopped and looked over the fjord. The sun was setting and the clouds turning blood red. I sensed a scream passing through nature. It seemed to me that I heard the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked. This became the scream.
We have these 4 versions, 2 paintings, 2 pastels, but there are also woodcuts, there are also drawings. So we have a kind of family orbiting this theme.
I think it's now generally accepted that the pastel 1893 version was the first, and possibly a study for the painting.
Well, the pastel that we have here is executed in what appears to be haste with crayon onto ungrounded cardboard. So it's a rather rough
expression.
1895, he had a German collector who's called Otto von Farkit. He did buy Despair and tried to buy the painted 1893 version. And it was a fantastically important picture to Munch. You know, he didn't want to sell it. And so he said to him, I'll sell you Despair and I'll make you a new Scream.
This one stands out because of its frame. So it has a very special frame in which he had inscribed almost a poem which reflected his vision.
The 1910 version, he needed to replace the 1893 version because it had gone. And so he did himself one in tempera on card. And, you know, but it is a sign of how important it was to him as a kind of central figure in his painting at that time.
They're all sort of quite different in both technique and style, and also to a certain extent content.
The colouring is different in each of them. Some of them are more highly coloured. There's slight differences in the compositions. And interestingly, if you look at the eyes, they're also depicted slightly differently.
I think in a certain point of his life, he saw that the Scream is a very, very special, very strong composition. But when he painted it, it was just one part of this work in progress called Frieze of Life. There's, of course, this famous poem-like text, which is older than the painting, where he is writing about walking with the two friends along the sea, and then suddenly the sky is turning red and he is hearing a big scream through nature.
I mean, it has been suggested his sister, Laura, was in a lunatic asylum at what has been identified as that point of the fjord, and that he might have been walking to see her, and, you know, that maybe didn't cheer him up.
While it is personal and he states this haunting moment in his life, it's also very universal. It's something that everyone can relate to. It's not him in the picture, it is just a figure.
It may have just been a figure, but it became an icon. And it would catch the attention of daring thieves, masked gunmen, and the world's richest art collectors. Edvard Munch's The Scream would not only become the work he would be most known for, it would become an iconic piece of art. Unfortunately, in 1994, it also became a prime target for a gang of Norwegian thieves.
It was the Lillehammer Olympics, all eyes on the country, and at the same time as the Olympics, there's also a kind of cultural Olympics going on, a focus on the cultural world of Norway, and of course the Scream would sit at the centre of that, one of their most iconic images, and actually one of the most iconic images in the world.
I remember watching the evening news, and that Sunday, the first day of the Winter Olympics, there was not so much news about the Olympics as the theft from the Oslo National Gallery.
Literally ran in and within 20 seconds had cut the painting, taken it from the wall, snipped the wire and gone. And they left a note saying, "Thank you for your terrible security."
Charly Hill is an art detective who just a year before The Scream was stolen had recovered another stolen masterpiece in Antwerp, Vermeer's Lady Writing a Letter.
An English criminal who had been arrested in Norway in a drugs matter went into the Norwegian embassy here in London and said that he could get the picture back for 5 million because he knew the people who'd done it. So the Norwegian chief of detectives came across and interviewed this guy.
Charly Hill would need a perfect cover to pull off a sting to reclaim The Scream. The thieves needed to believe that he was willing to cough up some serious dough to get the painting back. And the big spending Getty Museum were happy to oblige.
One of the detective sergeants flew to California and brought back a massive material to identify me as a member of the Getty Museum. And then I used that to persuade the criminals when I got to Oslo that I was a kosher Getty Museum employee, and it was part of the pretense, but it worked. And it worked well because the Getty were happy with it.
Under a false name of Chris Roberts, Charly Hill got in contact with the suspects in Oslo. Following a long drawn-out period of negotiations, Charly Hill ventured out to a location 70 miles outside the city to hopefully bring this complicated plan of recovery to a brilliant conclusion.
He said to me as we went in, "But it's down there in the basement." He pulled the carpet back and there was a trapdoor in the kitchen down. And I just flew at him and told him, "No, I'm not going down there to sit down there until next Christmas. You're going down there, and if it's there, you bring it back up. And he came up, and there he had a picture in a blue sheet. And he laid it down and flipped it back, and I'll be damned. As it turned out, it was the back of the picture. But Munch had started it already. And then I turned it over, and I knew straight away it was the right picture, because the thing about a masterpiece is it will tell you it's a masterpiece. Whether you're holding it in your hands or you're looking at it on the wall of a museum or wherever, behind glass and in a big frame, it will tell you straight away it's a masterpiece.
The scream had been recovered, but legal complications meant that the perpetrators of the theft were able to walk free. Then, 10 years after the first theft, another version of the scream was taken, this time in broad daylight.
In 2004, the Munch Museum's version of the scream was also stolen, on this occasion by armed thieves who rushed in and forced their way in and took the scream and another important painting, Madonna.
Well, they meant business. They used guns. The picture was missing for over 2 years.
Well, it's interesting that two separate versions of the scream were both stolen in Oslo. I mean, they're both such iconic paintings and also extremely valuable financially. So they were tempting targets for thieves.
The very thing that makes it so stealable, of course, it stops anybody being able to steal it, which is its fame. I would think bravado and stupidity would be two good reasons for why you might try to steal it.
Both this version of the scream and the Madonna painting were recovered in 2006, but we know far less about how this police operation went down. The next time that the scream would make international headlines was in 2012, when the least seen of the versions of the painting sold at auction for an astonishing $120 million.
This particular version had been in the family of a Norwegian businessman, Peter Olsen, for many, many years, and his family had been neighbours of Munch and turned out to be patrons, friends. So it's not one that had been seen, it had been hidden from view in the same place, which always makes value shoot up.
It was the most expensive painting which had ever been sold at that time. But of course, you only need two people at auction who want a painting for it to push up the value.
If you look at what's happened to stock markets over the past 20 years, they've gone like that. And if you look at what's happened to the value of gilt-edged, blue chip A-list art, it's gone like that.
Just like with Van Gogh's Sunflowers, Munch's scream has come to symbolize the artist. The two of them share many similarities. They both came to Paris and were inspired by the great artists of the Belle Epoque, especially Paul Gauguin. They were both unstable characters who forged their own artistic style. But whereas Vincent van Gogh died in 1890, Munch lived until old age.
The first part of his life, Munch is traveling all the time. He's really living from a suitcase. A lot of exhibitions, a lot of parties, a lot of relations and so on. And then after his breakdown in 1908, he's coming back to his home country. He's buying a big house, a villa with a huge garden. It's a little bit above the town, so he's looking down on the city. It's a very remote place.
My breakthrough came very late in life, only starting when I was 50 years old. But at that time, I felt as though I had the strength for new deeds and ideas.
He became more and more isolated and less involved with Oslo society. But most importantly, he continued to paint, and he did a magnificent series of self-portraits.
He painted himself again and again and again, and what he sees is disturbing and chilling, I think.
Munch may have wanted to live a reclusive life, but that became impossible with the outbreak of World War II.
In 1940, the Germans invaded Norway, and Munch was very concerned that his work would be confiscated by the Nazis because the Germans had regarded his paintings as degenerate.
All his works in Germany were confiscated from all the museums. They were sold in Norway or in Switzerland, and Munch didn't like it, of course.
82 pictures in German collections that were all taken off walls. Rather sweetly, 71 of them are bought in time by Norwegian collectors and brought back to Norway, which shows his status as the living Norwegian painter, I think.
He was very worried, and he decided to give leave his estate to the municipality of Oslo, and that is the basis of the collection in the Munch Museum, where it is on view today.
From my rotting body flowers shall grow, and I in them, and that is eternity.
After Munch's death, the Scream's international reputation would grow and grow.
It is an extraordinary work of art, and it represents something in Western European and worldwide thought.
At the turn of the 20th century, there was this terrific sort of apocalyptic fear. The picture, I think, spoke very directly to that fear. It was a very new-looking picture.
It's crossed continents, it's crossed cultures. It's been on The Simpsons to Andy Warhol. It's an image that we all know.
Covers of books and record sleeves, and we see all the accretions of its fame.
I think what is really well known is the face of the person in the middle. This person who's screaming has become a sort of a symbol of angst or psychological disturbance.
This work really shows the basic fear of the human being. So everyone, every visitor in this museum can put his own feelings in this painting, so it's timeless.